It's a question of how the Russian judge will apply the law in this case.
Now that the trial's over, attention will likely shift to a proposed swap made by the Biden administration in exchange for Brittney Griner and former Marine Paul Whelan, which we've heard a lot about. Notorious arms dealer Victor Bout could be freed from an American prison. Where does that proposal stand now?
I think the proposal is being negotiated between the United States and Russia. The United States has expressed its intention of trying to deal with this prisoner swap, but the leverage right now is with the Russian Federation because they haven't agreed to the swap and they haven't agreed to the terms of the swap. So until the Russians agree to exchange Brittney Griner for Victor Bout or somebody else, the Russians will have leverage into how fast this process goes.
We want to play some of Brittney Griner's own words in these closing arguments to hear what she had to say in pleading guilty and asking for leniency.
I understand everything that's being said against me, the charges that are against me, and that is why I pled guilty. But I had no intent to break any Russian laws. I want to apologize to my teammates, my club, Gemka, the fans, and the city of ECAT for my mistake that I made and the embarrassment that I brought onto them. I know everybody keeps talking about political pawn and politics, but I hope that that is far from this courtroom.
So, William, she made this emotional plea asking for leniency. Is that likely going to resonate with the Russian courtroom there?
Well, she might get a slightly lesser sentence. I think that the sentence would require almost 10 years in prison. I anticipate a slightly lesser sentence, but nevertheless a severe sentence as well. So I can't anticipate what the actual length of the sentence will be. But since she's been found guilty, since she pled guilty, I anticipate a significant sentence and significant time, unfortunately, for Brittney Griner.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point. I think some of our viewers might think that her defense team's, having her plead guilty was a strategy for potentially a lighter sentence. Are you saying that's not the case? Was that a good move? I mean, we should note that Russian criminal courts reportedly have a conviction rate of 99%. So, they were possibly just hoping for a lighter sentence.
I think the Russian counsel did the best they could in light of the Russian legal system. And they have tried to make a case for leniency, but it is up to the judge to decide what the sentence will be. So I think the Russian counsel did the best they could do in light of the system that works in the Russian Federation, and that pleading guilty, as opposed to contesting the charges, most likely was the best strategy.
I want to bring in now Jessica Levinson. She is a legal contributor for CBS News, and she's also been following this. Jessica, we've been talking to William about the legal strategy in trying to plead guilty and hope for a lesser sentence. We also are very interested in the potential that this is having greater ramifications geopolitically. How do you think that might factor in or not factor in to what's happening in Russia?
Well, obviously, we're having two tracks of conversations here. We're having the legal track, and that has almost come to an end at this point. I mean, the verdict is not a surprise. She pled guilty. As I just heard you discuss, Russia has a more than 99% conviction rate. And we're also having a conversation about the political track, which is, this offer of potentially we will swap prisoners. And I think we were really waiting when it came to that political track to see what happened in this case. It's not a surprise, but I understand that the political negotiations that people on both sides essentially indicated, let's wait to see for the trial to come to a conclusion. Now it puts a lot more pressure, I think, on the Biden administration to say, okay, the legal case is all but over. Now let's make a deal, because people do not want her to sit in a Russian prison cell for a decade.
I want to bring in also CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tayeb joining Jessica and William. Imtiaz, thanks for being here. What can you tell us about what you're hearing there overseas?
Hey, good to talk to you, and thanks for having me. Look, we're getting this information in real time. In fact, we're watching a feed right now where you can see Brittney Griner, which is essentially in this cage where her translator is telling her what's happening in the court. And she hasn't really betrayed an awful lot of emotion as she learned that she was convicted. And as we've been hearing and as we've been saying, we were expecting this conviction. She did admit to carrying these vape cartridges. It's extraordinary that when you consider the amount that she was carrying, such a small amount, we understand just under a gram, but in Russia, of course, those laws are fairly strict, and that is why she finds herself in this situation today. But again, we also saw a very emotional Brittney Griner as she addressed the court ahead of her conviction, where she basically said to the court, "Please don't take my life away. This was an honest mistake." She talked about how she loved playing in Russia with her team. She spent many years playing here, and she apologized profusely again and again, not only to the court, but to her teammates back home in the U.S., to her family, and to her spouse as well. And as you can imagine, this has been a terrible ordeal, not just for Brittney Griner, but for all who know her and all who love her. But again, as we've been saying, this isn't just the case of a decorated WNBA star caught up in Russia. This has much broader geopolitical ramifications involving the governments of Russia and the United States, whose relationship at this very moment is perhaps the worst it's been in decades. And that's saying a lot. And as we've been saying as well, we understand that the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, spoke to his own counterpart in Russia, Sergei Lavrov, the first time these two men have spoken since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in which a deal was presented to Russia. But again, as we've been understanding, that Russia came back with a counter argument or a counter offer, and that wasn't taken as very seriously. So Brittney Griner finds herself in a pretty terrible situation right now. She's been behind bars for 168 days. And while we're waiting for that sentencing, there is a very real chance that she could see herself behind bars for many years to come.
William, I want to get your take on something that Imtiaz said, as well as something that you were saying. Obviously, this is taking place in the context of very poor relations between the U.S. and Russia. But as you said, Russian laws are already very strict when it comes to drugs. Do you believe that she would be treated differently if we weren't in the middle of this international conflict and these poor relations between the two countries?
That's very hard to say. Other people who have found themselves in Russian courtrooms before the Ukraine-Russia war have received significant sentences. So it is, I would think, unlikely that it would be different in terms of the actual application of Russian law. The question about diplomacy is very important because Blinken and Lavrov really haven't talked to each other for the entire war in Ukraine. And so, yes, the relations are very strained. And as I mentioned before, I think Russia is in the driver's seat in these negotiations, since Biden has political pressure to try to bring Brittney Griner home. And Victor Bout has been in the American prison for over a decade. And although obviously it would be a great triumph for Vladimir Putin to get Victor Bout home, I don't think the Russians are in the same rush, as it were, as the United States.
Jessica, a little bit ago, we played some of Griner's final plea, saying this was a mistake, apologizing. Of course, the Russian court system is different than it is here in the U.S. Will her statements, do you think, have much of an impact in what her sentence will be as we await that final sentence?
So we don't know. And the answer is that, as in the US, a lot of this comes down to the judge and whether or not the judge wants to consider aggravating factors, mitigating factors, but not as with respect to the US. And as you've had this conversation already, I think that the Russian court system tends to be, for lack of a better way of describing this, much more stringent, much more tough on crime. Imagine in the US if we had a conviction rate approaching 100%. And so a conviction obviously is different from the length of the sentence, but prosecutors we know have asked for almost a decade here. And the fact that Brittney Griner has said, "I'm sorry, I apologize," we don't know how that's going to play in, because honestly, we would need to know how this judge reacts to pleas of "this is a mistake." And it's interesting that her defense really took, I think, two tracks. One was don't find her guilty, even though she pled guilty, and there were a bunch of kind of procedural and due process issues with respect to her detainment and her arrest. And the other was, well, please open your heart and kind of take pity on her. She made an honest mistake. This is a small amount. It was legal in her state, in Arizona, where she had a medical marijuana prescription. And we just don't know if either track will be successful when it comes to the length of the sentence. Again, this is such a fraught case because obviously it's playing out both in the courtroom, but also the judge has to be aware of what's happening outside in the political arena, where we do have these two countries whose relationship really has broken down, and they have to speak to each other because of her.
Imtiaz, Russian officials have said that any discussion about a prisoner swap would have to wait until this trial is over. Do you have any more sense of how quickly something like that might happen, or those negotiations that are happening?
Well, I think that in a way that's already been said. The ball is really in Russia's court, for lack of a better phrase. They are really the ones who can decide whether or not Brittney Griner and the other American who is held in a Russian prison, Michael Whelan, will be freed as part of this swap. And we have to, if we look at the broader global context of prisoner swaps, this doesn't happen a lot, right? The U.S. doesn't do this a lot. Other countries don't do it a lot. And it really just underscores the seriousness of which President Biden is taking this case. We have to understand he's been criticized quite harshly by figures within his own party and indeed many others who don't think he has done enough or reacted quickly enough when Brittney Griner was first arrested. Remember, she was arrested just days before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. And that's nearly 6 months ago, 168 days. And here we are now with this conviction. We're waiting to hear what her sentencing will be. But when it comes to how quickly some sort of deal can be reached, how soon we could see Brittney Griner go home, again, the ball really is in Russia's court, and it will be up to, frankly, I'd imagine it'd go all the way up to Vladimir Putin to decide what will happen next. I think the offer from the U.S. Of Victor Bout, who is, of course, a notorious arms dealer, it was somebody who is accused of being involved in pretty heinous crimes, for the U.S. to offer him up as a swap, I think is a pretty significant gesture. But we've been hearing that for the Russians so far, the sort of reaction they've had to this deal has been, and this is the words that we've been hearing from our sources on the ground in state, was that the Russians weren't taking it seriously enough. And so if that's the state of play we're at now, in which the White House doesn't feel, and more importantly, the State Department doesn't feel that Russia is taking this offer seriously and is coming back to them with counteroffers which don't feel serious either, we're really in a bind. And again, it really casts a shadow over Brittney Griner's future, because I'm certain her family was really heartened that the U.S. was offering this prisoner swap, that they were public about it. That in itself was surprising. And we understand at the time when it was announced that this prisoner swap, or rather when the prisoner swap deal was announced, we later learned that it was a very deliberate move by the State Department, because they wanted to put Russia under pressure to respond to it. But that response so far, as we've been saying, has not been, quote, serious enough. And so Brittney Brittney Griner, as she awaits for this sentencing, is certainly sitting there thinking, I've been behind bars for 168 days now. How much longer will I be behind bars? And as she said earlier in the court, please don't take my life from me. Please don't end my life. So this is a very serious situation for her as she waits to find out what's going to happen to her.
And MTS, as you're speaking, we can see the live feed of Brittney Griner just moments ago shaking her head, making us wonder, if in fact the sentence is being read. We are waiting to hear what that will be, but certainly a moment of disbelief, maybe shock and sadness for her as we watch her sitting in a cage in a Russian courtroom, looking down with translators behind her. We are waiting to hear from our own translators as we sit here in New York. Jessica, I just want to turn to you again. And we've touched on this a bit, but there's been criticism of the efforts of the WNBA and Griner's team, the Phoenix Mercury, to put pressure on President Biden to bring Brittney home. Some say all the media attention is making her seem more valuable to Moscow. What is your take on that?
I think that's a really difficult question, and I hate to answer it this way, but the real answer is we'll know after we know if there was a success with respect to a prisoner swap. I know that the Biden administration initially, I think, tried to, I don't want to say keep this quiet, but tried not to put as much of a spotlight as the WNBA and Brittney Griner supporters did, where they really put pressure on the Biden administration. I think their preference was to try and do this more behind the scenes and not to try and elevate her case beyond the case of any other American prisoner, for instance. Now, I think her supporters viewed it as a success that after that pressure, that there was the offer of a prisoner swap. And as you've had the conversation, I absolutely agree. So much of this, I think, really, Russia has the power here. They are the ones who are not in any particular hurry. I don't think they're feeling the same political pressure. And they're the ones who are going to have to make a determination about whether or not they want to go ahead with one of these offers. The U.S. government, I think, really is on the defensive, and that is in part because of the attention, obviously completely understandable attention, that was given to her. And she is getting I don't want to say legally in the Russian courtroom, but outside of the courtroom politically, she's obviously getting a different treatment than somebody who is not an athletic star. And it's really hard to determine in the end, is that going to ultimately, to your question, is that going to help her case, that there's more eyes on her, that there's more light on this case, or will it undermine what the Biden administration, I think, was hoping to do more behind the scenes?
Jessica, in addition to being an American, and we're seeing, I'm just going to pause for 1 second, because we are seeing her standing up in court for the first time. As Nikki said, we saw her shaking her head for the first time. Otherwise, she had been really poker faced. So we are poised to hear what the judge has decided in any moment in terms of what her sentence is going to be. Prosecutors asking for 9.5 years. They also say that they argue that she did it deliberately, that she intended to bring the cannabis into the country, that they have charged her not only with possession but also with drug smuggling. Does intent matter at all? Because we know that the defense has been arguing that this was a mistake. She was in a COVID fog. She had just packed everything really rapidly, and because she had a prescription for medical marijuana and was using it in the United States, that she never intended to bring this vape cartridge. Does that matter at all when it comes to this trial, Jessica?
So I think yes and no. The answer is that for American viewers, we're used to intent obviously making a difference when it comes to liability and culpability, and many times even in the sentence. So you might have a completely different sentence if you inadvertently violated a law. For instance, on the federal level in America, it is still not legal to possess marijuana. But Russian courts have different protections and, frankly, far fewer protections when it comes to criminal defendants. So it clearly didn't matter when it came to whether or not she was liable, whether or not she was culpable. And now in moments, I think we'll hear whether or not it makes any difference when it comes to the length of the sentence. Again, I think anything under 9.5 years, which is what the prosecutors asked for here, would indicate that maybe the judge did take the defense's arguments here into consideration, into the idea that, she did inadvertently do this, that obviously she wouldn't have wanted to find herself on, well, the inside of a cage as we see her right now. But again, that's an answer that we'll know really in a few moments as to whether or not that played in the judge's mind.
Jessica and MTS and our viewers, stay with us. I just want to share some other breaking news. We're just learning from the Justice Department. 4 Louisville, Kentucky police officers now face federal charges in the drug raid that led to the death of Breonna Taylor. Just to remind our audience, Breonna Taylor, 26-year-old, was fatally shot in Kentucky in March of 2020 when at least 7 police officers forced entry into her apartment as part of an investigation into drug dealing operations. I want to come back here. We're seeing some more movement in this Russian courtroom with Brittney Griner. MTS, I want to turn to you, and I'm, honestly not sure if you can address this, but do we have any idea what the conditions in the Russian prison where Brittney Griner will be, has been, are, and just generally any reaction you're hearing there in Europe? I know this is just happening.
Right. And before I answer that question, I should let you know that this has just come in. We do have a sentencing for Brittney Griner. She's been sentenced to 9 years in prison, and she has been fined 1 million rubles, which is around $16,000 or $17,000. So Brittney Griner, again, sentenced to 9 years in a Russian prison for these narcotics charges. Now, this is just 6 months less than what the prosecution was asking for. We have to remember that her lawyers had, for the entirety of the case, had appealed for leniency from this judge, trying to create a picture of an American athlete who was exhausted after a long flight, who had just recovered from COVID, who lived in a place where having a small quantity of this cannabis oil, which was prescribed to her from a doctor, it was a mistake, and that she packed it in haste, and it seems that has fallen on deaf ears in this court. Again, Brittney Griner sentenced to 9 years in prison and is going to be facing a fine of up to 1 million rubles, which again is around $16,000 or $17,000. And it really just underscores what we've been saying about this case, and more importantly about Russia's legal system when it comes to these crimes and when it comes to its court system generally. It usually doesn't bode very well for those who are caught up and who are accused of committing crimes, particularly drug crimes. And now we have this sentencing. But as far as the conditions go, we have heard from Brittney Griner in the past, in which she said that she was being cared for, and I think, again, being very careful in how she described the conditions in which she was or she's been imprisoned in. But we don't have a huge amount of information about the kind of food she's receiving or the cell that she sleeps in at night. What we do know is that she typically wears her own clothing, that when she enters the court, she often has photographs with her. She will have photographs of her family, of her loved ones, of her wife. And today she walked in with a photograph of her Russian team, a team she's been playing with for 7 years, a team which she says she loves and her teammates that she cares about, and a team that she apologized for because of this entire situation. And yet this image that she tried to project as somebody who cared about Russia, cared about her time in Russia, the years she spent in Russia, and perhaps more specifically, that the seriousness in which she took Russian laws, saying that she knew she broke the law and that she understood she did, and that is why she admitted her guilt in this case. Well, it would seem that wasn't enough for this judge. And as we've been saying, Brittney Griner now sentenced to 9 years in a Russian prison.
9 years. And one of the things that the defense for Griner said was that she had won the sympathy of her guards, her fellow prison inmates who supported her, according to the AP, by shouting, "Brittney, everything will be okay." But we know now that she has been sentenced to 9 years and a fine of roughly $16,000 US. Imtiaz, do you know anything more about an appeals process or what the next steps might be through the Russian judicial system?
It's very early days, and it's hard to say. I'd imagine that there would be some sort of appeals process, but I think more than anything, what Brittney Griner's family, what the NBA and her supporters will no doubt be putting even more pressure on the Biden administration, on the White House, on the State Department to do something to get her home. As we've been saying, prisoner swaps, while uncommon, are not unheard of. We understand that in the past, Americans caught up in Russia, given sentences which may seem disproportionate to the crime, have been swapped in the past, and that the hope is that this will happen for Brittney Griner. The difference now is that the tensions between Moscow and Washington, which of course, as we know, has historically been tense for decades and decades, but in this specific moment in which we've now had over 5 months since Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, in which we know the first time that the Secretary of State spoke to his counterpart was specifically about Brittney Griner, a conversation between these two diplomats, which frankly did not happen since the start of that invasion, which really gives you a sense of just how frosty ties have become. But none of that has resulted in some sort of an agreement which will see Brittney Griner sent home. As we've been saying, the U.S. has offered to swap Brittney Griner and a man by the name of Paul Whelan, another American who's being held in a Russian prison, that the two of them be swapped with a man known as Victor Bout. Victor Bout is a notorious arms dealer. He's considered a very dangerous person, but it really just underscores just how much the State Department and indeed the White House wants to resolve this. That they're offering a Russian who, again, is accused of pretty heinous crimes to free not only Brittney, but of course Mr. Whelan as well. But so far, nothing has happened, and has been said already, the ball really remains in Russia's court, and quite frankly, remains in Vladimir Putin's court. One would imagine that any decision made on Brittney Griner's future will come down to Vladimir Putin, whether or not he wants to do this prisoner swap or not. But given just how tense the relationship is between the U.S. and Russia is right now, I think there's a lot of people who are looking at this situation and are very worried about her, very worried that she could see herself behind bars for a very long time. Again, as we've been saying, she's already been in prison for 168 days. She's now been sentenced to a further 9 years in prison. And the question now is whether she will spend that much time behind bars.
We're seeing images of what looks like some sort of press conference as we wait to see who does speak. Just want to remind viewers that when Brittney Griner's wife spoke with CBS Morning, she told Gayle King, of course, she was terrified Brittney would be in prison for life. She does face 9 years. We understand that Cherelle Griner will not be making a statement imminently. We will wait to hear on any statements from Griner's defense teams. Imtiaz, again, a question I'm not sure you can totally answer, but we touched on a little bit. Brittney Griner, as we've said, has been in prison already for 24 weeks. What do we know about what her state of mind has been? Of course, this is a whole new ballgame now that she's been sentenced to 9 years, but what can you tell us?
Yeah, it was really interesting watching her in the court. Obviously, this entire proceeding has been very complicated for her. She's in a Russian court. Most of, obviously, what's spoken there is Russian. She does have a translator, and so she is told what's being said in court. But if we look back to the very beginning of this ordeal and the first time that we heard from Brittney Griner, which was around a week ago when she addressed the court and kind of explained what happened, she said, I'd just gotten off this really long flight. I just recovered from COVID. And then I was taken into custody and I was asked all these questions and I didn't really understand what was going on, and I was made to sign things that I didn't understand. And I think that really sort of underscores a lot of her experience up until now, which is that she really didn't get a sense of what was going on, didn't get a sense of what her rights were, didn't really get a sense of what she was being accused of. And now here she is, a convicted criminal in Russia and somebody who has been sentenced to 9 years in prison on narcotics charges. And again, we saw from Brittney Griner in the court today, before this conviction was announced and of course the sentencing was announced, an emotional person. I mean, she really, her voice quivered when she was describing her fears and more importantly talking about the situation that she faced. Again, saying that she hopes that her life doesn't end. And I can't imagine what it must be like to be sitting in a courtroom so far away from her home to learn that she's been sentenced to 9 years in prison. And as you rightly point out, her wife gave an interview to Gayle King on CBS Mornings, and it's clear there's a lot of love between these two spouses. Brittney Griner has mentioned her every single time that she's spoken to the court, and this is no doubt very difficult for her. And again, when we heard from her today, the one thing Brittney Griner was doing over and over again was apologizing to her wife, apologizing to her family, apologizing to her team in Arizona, and apologizing to her team in Russia as well. It's very clear that she feels terrible about this situation, and of course is no doubt very scared about what's to come given this sentencing. And she also finds herself in the middle of a massive geopolitical situation between two very powerful countries who are at odds with each other. And this is a pretty extraordinary situation.
And on that note, Imtiaz, we are just hearing from President Biden, who's weighing in. He has a statement saying today American citizen Brittney Griner received a prison sentence. That is one more reminder of what the world already knew. Russia is wrongfully detaining Brittney. It is unacceptable, and I call on Russia to release her immediately so she can be with her wife, loved ones, friends, and teammates. My administration will continue to work tirelessly and pursue every possible avenue to bring Brittney and Paul Whelan home safely as soon as possible. To speak more on this, I want to bring in now Jonathan Franks. He is a spokesperson for Trevor Reed, who was freed in a prisoner swap with Russia back in April. Thanks for being here, Jonathan. We know that Trevor had also received a 9-year sentence in a Russian prison, just like the sentence that Brittney Griner has just received. Can you tell us anything more about, now as the attention is shifting to the possibility of a prisoner swap, what that would mean? And we understand that for your client, it meant for him 3 years in a Russian prison. Might Brittney Griner be looking at a substantial amount of time before this can be ironed out?
And thanks for having me. The simple answer is yes. She could be looking at a substantial period of time. I hope that's not the case. I watched her set the feed of her sentencing today.
I'm so sorry, Jonathan. As this is breaking news, we are just now hearing from a spokesperson outside of.
I attended every session of Ms. Griner's trial. We will continue to be closely engaged in this case. We will remain in frequent contact with Ms. Griner and with her legal team. Secretary of State Blinken, President Biden's national security team, and the entire American government remain committed to bringing Ms. Griner home safely to her family, friends, and loved ones. And I, as chargé d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, will also do my best to bring her home safely. I will continue to do everything to care for the safety and well-being of Ms. Griner and of all U.S. citizens detained in the Russian Federation. We have no higher priority. Thank you.
Is it still possible to change her?
I have no further.
We were just hearing from the chargé d'affaires for U.S. citizens saying there's no higher priority than bringing home U.S. citizens who are wrongfully detained, which is the position of the U.S. government. Jonathan, sorry to have interrupted you, but obviously with breaking news, we pivot to where the story is. Please continue when we're talking about prisoner swaps. What's next for Brittney Griner?
What's next is she could be very well transferred to prison camp. And I've been watching the so-called proceeding today with Google Translate's help. I found that proceeding absurd. There's no other way to, there was numerous pieces of irrelevant, prejudicial evidence that I'm not sure was introduced in court. A bizarre theater of the absurd today, because this has been in the can since she was charged and orchestrated from above. So I think we didn't really see a court appearance today. We saw a shellacking, and it's just absolutely horrendous. It was horrendous when it was done to Trevor Reed. It was horrendous when it was done to Paul Whelan. It was horrendous when it was done to Mark Vogel. 9 years for allegedly having the cannabis equivalent of a cigarette butt is absurd.
Jonathan, as you've watched other Americans on trial in Russia and you compare some of what you just described, what Brittney Griner's trial has looked like and what has unfolded during this time, reminding our audience that this all began a week before Russia invaded Ukraine. Have you seen any differences in Griner's, court case in the trial?
Yes, and yes, I think that the trial was higher profile. It was shorter because she pled guilty. Trevor did not plead guilty, but it does seem to me to be this, relatively similar. And I kind of, it's theater of the absurd. Nothing ever seems to matter. I mean, her lawyers put forth an excellent, case on mitigation, both her contribution to both Russian and American society, and the fact that the search didn't comply with Russian law. And that didn't seem to make a difference. I mean, 9 years seems to be the magic number for their hostage taking these days.
Jonathan, that's a very interesting point that there are several points in which the defense has argued that she was not afforded the rights that are provided to all people who are accused of crimes under Russian laws. Thank you for joining us. We're going to continue the conversation with Imtiaz and Jessica. Jessica, it's important to acknowledge that in addition to obviously being a high-profile American in the context of strife between Russia and the U.S., she's also a Black woman who is a member of the LGBTQ community, and Russia has, and President Putin in particular, have been criticized for their treatment of LGBTQ people and crackdowns that have denied human rights to those. Tell us more about that context and how that may be concerning people who are supporting Brittney Griner.
Well, I think that's why people were listening, or part of the reason why people were listening so carefully, for instance, to what her conditions are in terms of how she's being held and how she may be held. And I think you're exactly right to point this out. We're talking about a woman of color who's a member of the LGBT community. And we know that Russia is not a place, at least under Vladimir Putin, where they have pushed for equality. I mean, that may be the understatement of the morning, but they have not treated the LGBT community as being deserving of equal rights. They have treated them with discrimination. And so I think, again, that's why when we hear reporting of the prison guards, for instance, saying, Brittney, we're with you, a lot of people have more concern maybe than they would for another American, Caucasian male, for instance, about what is actually happening to her while she's being held and what may happen to her next. Now, obviously, we don't know how any of those dynamics in terms of her identity and who she is played into the trial and the sentencing, because we know, again, it's worth emphasizing, Russian courts are not like American courts. The protections that we enjoy when it comes to criminal defendants are a far cry from what we see in many foreign countries, but in particular now we're seeing in a Russian courtroom. And so I think we're exactly right to ask the question of what will happen to her and will she be treated, frankly, in a way that is even more concerning because she's a woman of color, because she's a member of the LGBT community. I think President Biden's statement here is really unequivocal, and he's saying this is a top priority to bring her home in a way that gives him, I think, it decreases some of his bargaining power, right? To say, we need this, we want this, we're putting this as a top priority. But he has to say that because we're all talking about this, we're all watching, and we're all, frankly, or I'll speak for myself, worried that she is going to be inside a Russian prison for 9 years and worried about what that will mean for her.
Imtiaz, I want to turn back to you again. I know we're just hearing this news, but have we heard any reaction from other foreign leaders? What might we anticipate reaction from just Europeans across the board?
Well, I think the nations that obviously are naturally aligned with the U.S. are certainly going to be appalled at this conviction and are certainly going to be advising their citizens not to travel to Russia and to be very mindful when they do travel to Russia. This conviction of, frankly, of somebody who is now high profile and is certainly going to cause a lot of alarm for a lot of people. It basically says that you can be a two-time Olympic gold medalist, you can be a WNBA star, you can be somebody who has spent 7 years of their life in Russia, who has committed to spending a lot of time living in Russia, playing with Russian teammates, having friends in Russia, having a life in Russia, and even then you could be essentially face some of the stiffest penalties that a court can give, ignoring the broader context of what we've been saying about Brittney Griner, whether or not her arrest itself followed the letter of the law in Russia, and more importantly, if this verdict is fitting to the crime that she committed, which is having a very small amount of cannabis oil, which was prescribed to her by a doctor. But again, it really just widens the lens here because we are looking at this from a geopolitical point of view. This is obviously a very terrible situation for Brittney Griner. It's a terrible situation for her family, her loved ones, and indeed Brittney Griner's teammates in Russia and indeed in the U.S. But this has, as we've been saying, huge geopolitical ramifications. Again, just moments after her sentencing, we hear from the U.S. president with this pretty sharp statement, and it really just underscores the situation and perhaps more importantly the tense relationship between Moscow and Washington right now, and how hard it may be for them to come up with some kind of an agreement which will see her released, if it's going to be this prisoner swap. And again, the calculus now lies on the Russian side as to whether or not they think it's in their best interest to antagonize the U.S., because hanging on to her is certainly going to antagonize the U.S., and that is something that they want to do in the short term. But as we've been hearing, when it comes to Brittney Griner herself, as part of the sentencing of 9 years, we also understand she's going to be sent to a penal colony. Now, what that means in real terms, well, it's hard to say, but I suppose if we use our imagination, it's probably not going to be great, and she's going to find herself in a very difficult situation for an unknown period of time. The hope is that negotiations between Russia and the U.S. Will move quickly, and that she'll be sent home just as quickly. But given how tense things are, and given what we understand about the initial interaction between Sergei Lavrov, who is the Russian foreign minister, and the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, that it's not looking great, quite frankly. And so we understand that the U.S. will continue to pursue this deal, continue to pursue a way to get Brittney Griner and indeed Paul Whelan out of Russia. But as of today, it seems we're no further ahead in this situation. And Brittney Griner is now trying to absorb the enormity of what's just happened. She's been sentenced to 9 years in a Russian penal colony, and after spending already 24 weeks behind bars.
Imtiaz, does this give pause to other U.S. citizens who may be living in Russia or thinking about traveling to Russia? We know that the State Department has weighed in on this particular case, but do we know, is there greater guidance given how they feel Brittney Griner has been unfairly treated?
Yeah, it's really interesting. in my job as a journalist, we travel to complicated places, and oftentimes there are travel advisories from the State Department saying you shouldn't go to this country or you should leave this country. U.S. citizens are advised to leave. Russia is no different. The reality is, though, is when you speak to Americans who are living in countries that are going through challenging times or have challenging relationships with the country that they're from, in this case the U.S., that oftentimes people make decisions which, go against the advice that the State Department or the government has. And that's because in the case of Brittney Griner, she had a team that she'd played for 7 years. She spent a lot of time in Russia. It was a team that she was very close to, and as evidence in her statements in the court, was very proud to play for. And perhaps even if you want to widen the lens a bit more, it really underscores the challenges that professional basketball players who play for the WNBA have, in which they need to supplement their incomes, and many of them play abroad. And for Brittney Griner, she chose to play abroad in Russia. And now look at the situation she finds herself in. And so when you consider Americans abroad, Americans in Russia, and indeed in other countries, at the end of the day, the U.S. Can't force them to come home, but this really is a cautionary tale that you're flying to Russia, a place that you know well, a place that you've played professionally for years, in the case of Brittney Griner, and you pack a bag really quickly and you're just recovering from COVID and it's a really long flight, and you throw a bunch of stuff into what we now know to be a very large suitcase or backpack, and at the very bottom of it is 1 or 2 grams of a medically prescribed cannabis oil, and because that was in her bag, she's now sentenced to 9 years in a Russian penal colony and is at the center of this geopolitical storm. And so, I think for those Americans who are currently in Russia, still in Russia, in spite of everything, this will certainly be a huge concern to them, and perhaps maybe that very reason why they do choose to leave.
We are seeing now what looks like a Russian official speaking Russian. While we wait to hear what he is saying from our translators, Jessica, I just want to turn to you. I mean, what would you say to Brittney Griner's family, friends, fans, sort of who may be confused about what might be next, the legal process in Russia? Do you have anything you would say to them?
So we know the reporting is that her lawyers do plan to appeal. I will reiterate what I said before, which is that the Russian court system is not like the American court system. And so every step of the way, we have really seen the differences, and frankly, the differences in lack of protection for criminal defendants. And so, yes, there will be an appeal. I, again, suspect that the appeal that's going to matter is the political appeal. It's not the appeal that's going to happen inside the courtroom. And so, speaking to her family, speaking to her supporters, I wish I had something more specific or perhaps even optimistic to say, other than I don't have a lot of hope for an appeal, in part because of how we saw this trial run in the first place. And I think that the pressure that we're going to see politically really is her hope. I don't think that her hope for freedom, for not being in that penal colony for 9 years, is going to come through the legal system. It's going to come through political negotiations. And it's something that we've talked about throughout the morning, because I think this was all but preordained. They made the calculation that she would, in fact, plead guilty. There was a defense that I think was as vigorous as it could be, essentially saying, again, that she should not be found guilty, but if she is, please be lenient in a sentence. We found that neither one of those defenses was successful. Again, I think expectedly. And now we really are going to have to wait to see how this plays out with the State Department, with the Biden administration, and with the Russian government, with Vladimir Putin. He knows that we're watching, that we're talking, and that this is important to us. And I do think that puts us in a difficult situation.
If you're just joining us, we have breaking news on the development of Brittney Griner's legal case in Russia. She has been convicted of drug possession. She has been sentenced to 9 years in prison. Our colleague Imtiaz Tayeb tells us that that is expected to be served in a penal colony. She also has been fined roughly the equivalent of $16,000 US, 1 million rubles. We are following her case as well as some other developing news that the Justice Department has charged 4 Louisville police officers with federal charges in that drug raid that led to Breonna Taylor's death. We are going to be following that story. The LMPD officers, as you'll recall, shot Taylor to death after knocking down her door while executing a search warrant. She was not a subject of that warrant. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced the charges this morning. We are expecting at any moment that we will have a press conference that will have more information on that. We are lucky to be joined by Jessica Levinson, who's a legal contributor for us, and we have talked with Jessica in the past about Breonna Taylor's case. What is your first take on these federal charges coming, Jessica, for these 4 former Louisville police officers?
So we see these are very serious charges, and this is breaking news, so forgive me for looking down for a moment. We see civil rights offenses, unlawful conspiracy, unconstitutional use of force, and obstruction offenses. Essentially, what they're being charged with is what they did before the tragedy occurred, and then what they did after to try and cover up the tragedy. So there are 4 different officers charged here. There are slightly different charges with respect to 3 of the officers as compared to the other one, but they are charged with making false statements. They're charged with